In the high-stakes, hyper-competitive world of Silicon Valley tech startups, there are only two types of people: the builders and the parasites. The builders are the ones sitting in the dark at 3 a.m., fueled by cold brew and sheer manic focus, writing the millions of lines of code that actually make the modern world function. The parasites are the executives in the custom-tailored suits who don't know the difference between a Python script and a dead snake, but who possess a terrifying sociopathic talent for stealing the credit. For 4 exhausting, soul-crushing years, I was the ultimate builder. And my boss, Richard, was the undisputed king of the parasites. I was the senior lead data architect for a financial technology firm called Aegis Analytics. When I was hired, the company was nothing more than a failing mid-tier data processing firm circling the drain of bankruptcy. But I had an idea. Working entirely on my own time, sacrificing my weekends, my sleep, and my personal life, I developed an incredibly complex proprietary machine learning algorithm. We called it Project Oracle. In simple terms, Oracle could analyze global supply chain fluctuations, geopolitical news, and micro-market trends in real time, predicting stock market movements with an unprecedented 84% accuracy rate. It wasn't just a good piece of software, it was a digital goldmine. It was the kind of algorithmic holy grail that massive Wall Street hedge funds would literally kill to possess. Because I was the sole architect of Oracle, my original employment contract included a very specific ironclad clause: a 5% founder's equity stake if the company was ever acquired or taken public, provided I was still an active employee at the exact moment the ink dried on the sale. 5% doesn't sound like a lot, until you realize the valuation Oracle brought to the table. Within months of deploying the beta version, a massive multinational tech conglomerate offered to acquire Aegis Analytics for a staggering $1.2 billion. My 5% equity was suddenly worth $60 million. I thought my years of grueling, thankless labor were finally going to pay off. I thought my life was about to change forever. I severely underestimated Richard's greed. Richard was the vice president of engineering, which was a hilarious title considering the man couldn't format an Excel spreadsheet without calling IT for help. He was a bloated, red-faced man who smelled aggressively of expensive cologne and spent 80% of his workday on exclusive golf courses. His only real skill was corporate political maneuvering. As the $1.2 billion acquisition deal grew closer, Richard began systematically erasing my name from every internal document, every presentation, and every patent application. He stood on stages at tech conferences, sweating under the spotlights, confidently presenting my algorithm as his own personal brainchild. He was positioning himself to receive a massive 9-figure executive bonus from the acquiring company, and he viewed my $60 million equity payout as money that rightfully belonged in his pocket. But Richard had a fatal flaw. He was so technically illiterate and so arrogant that he fundamentally misunderstood how Project Oracle actually operated. 2 years prior, when I was building the infrastructure, the company board had aggressively slashed my department's budget. They flat out refused to pay for the enterprise-grade, highly secure cloud servers required to host the algorithm's massive proprietary datasets. To keep the project alive, I had to use a legal loophole. With written, signed, but incredibly short-sighted approval from Richard himself, I hosted the absolute core of the predictive engine, the literal brain of the billion-dollar product, on my own, privately owned, heavily encrypted offshore servers. Aegis Analytics was just renting access to it through an API key. They owned the brand, but I literally owned the brain. The betrayal happened exactly 48 hours before the massive acquisition was legally scheduled to close. The champagne was already ordered. The press releases were drafted. I was sitting at my desk, quietly debugging a minor visual glitch in the user dashboard when I got a cold, formal calendar invite. I was summoned to the glass-walled conference room at the end of the hall. When I walked in, Richard was sitting at the head of the long mahogany table. flanked by two stone-faced representatives from Human Resources and the company's lead corporate attorney. He didn't look me in the eye. He was staring at his manicured fingernails, a disgusting, smug little smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Have a seat," Richard said, his voice dripping with faux sympathy. "I'll get right to the point. As we prepare for the transition of the acquisition, we are restructuring the engineering department. Unfortunately, your position is being eliminated, effective immediately. We feel you just aren't a cultural fit for the new corporate direction." My stomach dropped into a bottomless abyss. It wasn't about restructuring, it was a sniper shot. By terminating me 48 hours before the sale finalized, my employment contract was immediately voided. My 5% equity clause, my $60 million, was legally vaporized, perfectly reabsorbed into the executive bonus pool. Richard was stealing my life's work, taking the absolute credit, and tossing me onto the street with a standard 2-week severance package. "We need your company laptop, your key card, and your security badge right now," the HR director stated, sliding a manila folder across the table. "Security will escort you to your desk to collect your personal items." Richard finally looked up at me. He expected me to scream. He expected me to cry, to throw a tantrum, or to beg for my job on my hands and knees. He wanted to savor the absolute crushing victory of ruining me. But I didn't scream. I felt a sudden, terrifying calm wash over my entire body. I looked at Richard's sweaty, triumphant face, and then I thought about the physical location of the encrypted servers humming quietly in a data center 3,000 miles away. Servers that he didn't own, didn't understand, and had just legally severed all ties to by firing me. I didn't say a single word. I slowly reached into my bag, pulled out my company laptop, and gently slid it across the mahogany table. I stood up, offered Richard a chilling, dead-eyed smile, and walked out of the glass room. He thought he had just saved $60 million. He had no idea he had just destroyed a $1.2 billion empire. The perp walk is a time-honored tradition in Silicon Valley. When you get fired from a tech firm, they don't let you linger. They treat you like a highly contagious biohazard. 2 massive, unsmiling security guards escorted me back to my cubicle, handed me a cardboard box, and stood uncomfortably close while I packed up 3 years of my life. A customized mechanical keyboard, a few framed photos, and a favorite coffee mug. That was it. The entire engineering floor had gone dead silent. Dozens of my colleagues, people who knew exactly how much blood and sweat I had poured into Project Oracle, kept their heads down, staring intensely at their monitors, terrified that making eye contact with me would put them next on the chopping block. As I walked toward the elevator banks, holding my pathetic little cardboard box, I glanced up at the second-floor executive mezzanine. Richard was standing there, leaning against the glass railing, holding a cup of artisan coffee. He gave me a tiny, patronizing wave. The wave of a man who firmly believed he had just successfully committed the perfect corporate robbery. I didn't scowl. I didn't flip him off. I just gave him that same cold, chilling smile, stepped into the elevator, and let the steel doors slide shut. When I finally reached the blazing afternoon heat of the parking lot, I didn't cry. I walked directly to my incredibly average 5-year-old Honda Civic, which was parked 3 spaces down from Richard's obnoxiously bright yellow Porsche 911, got into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. Most people in my position would have been contemplating hiring an employment lawyer to fight a grueling, multi-year legal battle over the voided equity. But I didn't need a lawyer. I just needed a Wi-Fi connection. I opened the glove compartment, pulled out my personal air-gapped laptop, and tethered it to my phone's secure hotspot. I booted up the machine, bypassed 3 layers of biometric security, and opened a secure command terminal connecting directly to my private servers hosted in a data center in Iceland. Here is the brilliant, beautiful thing about corporate executives like Richard. They do not read technical documentation. 2 years ago, when the board refused to pay for the necessary server infrastructure, I had Richard sign a Master Service Agreement, MSA, approving the use of my personal hardware. Because I was thorough, I had structured that MSA as a legal licensing agreement between Aegis Analytics and a private LLC I had registered in Delaware. The contract clearly stated that Aegis was strictly licensing the machine learning engine, but the most crucial clause, the poison pill that Richard had blindly skimmed and signed with his expensive Mont Blanc pen, was the termination condition. It stated that if my employment at Aegis Analytics was ever terminated for any reason, the licensing agreement was immediately revoked, and my servers were contractually obligated to sever the API connection to protect my proprietary intellectual property. I wasn't about to hack Aegis Analytics. Hacking is a federal crime. I was simply executing the exact legally binding contract that my boss had signed. My fingers flew across the keyboard. The terminal window reflected in my eyes, a cascade of green text on a black background. First, I targeted the API gateways. These were the digital bridges that allowed Aegis's shiny user dashboard to communicate with my algorithm. Command: revoke all access tours. Execute. In a fraction of a second, the bridge was destroyed. The Aegis dashboard was now completely blind, cut off from the predictive engine. But I wasn't finished. When you deal with proprietary data, you leave nothing to chance. I initiated a remote zero-fill command targeting Aegis's local cache servers. It was a security protocol I had built into the system to protect against corporate espionage. It was designed to automatically scrub any temporary residual fragments of my algorithm from their local hardware in the event of an unauthorized breach. And my termination legally qualified as a breach. I watched the progress bar rapidly fill across the screen. Wiping cache node 1. Complete. Wiping cache node 2. Complete. Purging all predictive data assets. I held my breath. The terminal paused for 3 agonizing seconds, verifying the encryption protocols, and then the final message flashed onto the screen in bold, undeniable text. Deletion successful. All proprietary data gone. Connection severed. I closed the laptop and let out a long, shuddering breath. The deed was done. Project Oracle, the $1.2 billion golden goose, was dead. To the casual observer, the Aegis Analytics user interface would look perfectly normal. The login screen would work. The graphics would load. But the moment you tried to actually run a market prediction, it would return nothing but a fatal error code. It was a flawless, beautiful Ferrari with no engine under the hood. I put my car in drive and pulled out of the parking lot, taking one last look at Richard's yellow Porsche in the rearview mirror. Tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., the executive board of the acquiring multinational conglomerate was flying in for the final live due diligence demonstration. They were bringing their top engineers to look under the hood of the algorithm before signing the final billion-dollar wire transfer. Richard had planned to stand on a stage, click a button, and show them magic. I went home, ordered an incredibly expensive pizza, poured myself a glass of red wine, and turned off my phone. I was going to sleep incredibly well tonight, because tomorrow, Richard was going to wake up and step onto a landmine. I obviously wasn't in the building the next morning to witness the carnage firsthand, but I didn't need to be. My former junior developer, a brilliant but anxious 23-year-old named Toby, was sitting in the back row of the presentation hall. For the entire duration of the meeting, Toby had his phone hidden under his notebook, frantically texting me a real-time play-by-play transcript of Richard's spectacular slow-motion execution. Sitting at my kitchen table, sipping a perfectly brewed cup of coffee in my pajamas, I watched the greatest corporate disaster in Silicon Valley history unfold via blue text bubbles. The morning started with nauseating opulence. Aegis Analytics had spared no expense to impress the acquiring multinational conglomerate. They had catered a massive breakfast spread with imported pastries, cold-pressed juices, and artisanal espresso. The executive boardroom was packed. On one side of the mahogany table sat Richard and the Aegis board of directors, practically vibrating with the anticipation of their massive, unearned payouts. On the other side sat the buyers, a team of ruthless, stone-faced corporate sharks led by a terrifyingly sharp chief technology officer named Elena. Elena wasn't a suit. She was an actual engineer who had climbed the ranks. She didn't care about marketing buzzwords. She was there to dissect the code. At exactly 9 a.m., Richard took the stage. Toby texted me that Richard was wearing a custom Italian suit, sweating profusely through his expensive cologne, and projecting a massive PowerPoint presentation on the 80-inch wall monitors. For the first 20 minutes, Richard gave his standard, nauseating Steve Jobs routine. He threw around meaningless phrases like synergistic machine learning, quantum-adjacent data processing, and disrupting the financial paradigm. He spoke passionately about his vision for the algorithm, entirely omitting the fact that he couldn't even explain the difference between Java and a cup of coffee. Elena let him talk. She sat perfectly still, hands steepled, watching him with the cold, predatory gaze of a hawk analyzing a very fat, very loud mouse. When Richard finally finished his grand monologue, he gestured dramatically toward the main user interface displayed on the screen. "And now, ladies and gentlemen," Richard announced, his chest puffed out, "I would like to demonstrate the sheer predictive power of Project Oracle." "Skip the canned simulation," Elena interrupted, her voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. She opened her titanium laptop and slid a physical USB drive across the table. "We know how to fake a dashboard. I brought a proprietary, heavily encrypted dataset from our own internal market testing. It represents a simulated flash crash of the Asian markets. Plug that drive into your system, ingest the data, and let's see how Oracle handles a real-time, localized economic collapse." According to Toby, Richard swallowed so hard it was audible in the back row, but his arrogance wouldn't let him back down. He smiled nervously, plugged the USB drive into the podium console, and imported the data into the Aegis user dashboard. "Certainly, Elena," Richard stammered, his hand shaking slightly as he gripped the mouse. "You are about to witness the fastest predictive modeling on the market." Richard moved the cursor over the massive green Run Predictive Analysis button. He flashed a brilliant, confident smile to his board of directors, and he clicked the mouse. In my apartment, my phone buzzed with a message from Toby. Toby. He just clicked it. Oh my God. In the boardroom, the UI wheel started spinning. The progress bar moved to 5%, then 10%. Richard's smile grew wider. He opened his mouth to make another self-congratulatory remark. And then the system violently flatlined. The beautiful, custom-designed dashboard didn't just freeze, it entirely collapsed. The screen violently flickered, the Aegis logo shattered into pixelated fragments, and the 80-inch monitors instantly filled with a wall of blinding red text. It wasn't a standard error message. It was the brutal, undeniable system alert I had triggered the night before. Fatal exception. Kernel missing. API connection refused. Error 404. Algorithmic engine not found. Authorization, master license revoked. The silence in the boardroom was so profound, you could hear the air conditioning humming. Richard stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. Just a minor network glitch, he choked out, his face rapidly draining of all color. Toby, get up here, fix the Wi-Fi connection. Toby, trembling, walked up to the podium. He leaned over the keyboard, pulled up the developer console, and typed in a diagnostic command. He didn't even need to look for long. Toby saw the zero-filled cache. He saw the severed API route. He saw my name on the revoked license agreement. Toby slowly stood up, stepped away from the podium, and looked Richard dead in the eye. "The Wi-Fi is fine, Richard," Toby whispered, his voice echoing in the silent room. "The engine is gone. The core algorithm isn't on our servers. It's hosted externally, and the owner just terminated our access." Elena didn't gasp. She didn't yell. She stood up, walked around the table, and shoved Richard out of the way. She placed her hands on the keyboard and started rapidly auditing the system logs herself. It took her exactly 45 seconds to uncover the absolute depths of Richard's incompetence. She turned around, her eyes blazing with absolute, unadulterated fury. She looked directly at Richard, who was now sweating so heavily his silk shirt was clinging to his chest. "You don't own this product," Elena said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly whisper. "The logs clearly state that Aegis Analytics was merely licensing the algorithm from a private LLC, a license that was legally revoked yesterday at 4:12 p.m., the exact time you filed the termination paperwork for your senior data architect." The CEO of the acquiring conglomerate stood up, his face a mask of pure rage. "You brought us here," he snarled, slamming his fist onto the mahogany table, "to buy a $1.2 billion software company, and you don't even own the software? You fired the only person who actually possessed the product?" Richard was hyperventilating, backing away from the podium, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of defense. I can fix this. She stole it. I'll sue her. I'll get it back." "You can't sue someone for taking their own property," Elena shot back, slamming her laptop shut. "You are a fraud, Richard. This entire company is an empty shell. The deal is dead." The buyers didn't linger. They packed their briefcases in a synchronized, furious motion and marched out of the glass doors without another word. The $1.2 billion acquisition evaporated into thin air in less than 5 minutes. My phone buzzed one last time on the kitchen table. Toby. They just walked out. Richard is literally crying on the floor. "I'm going home." I smiled, took another sip of coffee, and watched the morning news. I had detonated the bomb. But the true nuclear fallout was only just beginning. Because while Richard was crying over a lost billion-dollar deal, he hadn't yet realized that his desperate attempt to secure government funding the previous year was about to turn this corporate failure into a massive federal crime. When a $1.2 billion corporate acquisition collapses in Silicon Valley, it does not happen quietly. It is a seismic event, an immediate financial bloodbath that sends shockwaves through the entire industry. By noon that same day, the rumors had already breached the sealed doors of the Aegis Analytics boardroom. By 2 p.m., the story had leaked to Bloomberg and the Wall Street Journal. The headline on CNBC was brutal. Aegis Analytics billion-dollar buyout implodes. Core tech allegedly missing. The company wasn't publicly traded yet, but their private valuation, which had been artificially inflated by the impending sale, cratered. In a matter of hours, Aegis went from being a tech unicorn to a toxic, radioactive wasteland. Investors began frantically pulling their term sheets. The board of directors held an emergency vote and immediately suspended Richard, stripping him of his executive access and freezing his corporate accounts. But losing his job and his imaginary $60 million bonus was the absolute least of Richard's problems. Because corporate negligence is a civil issue, but stealing taxpayer money is a federal crime. To understand the absolute, inescapable trap Richard had walked into, you have to look back exactly 14 months. Before the multinational conglomerate tried to buy us, Aegis Analytics was burning through venture capital cash at a terrifying rate. Desperate to keep the lights on and inflate the company's value, Richard had aggressively pursued government contracts. He applied for a highly competitive, massive federal grant from the Department of Defense, DoD, specifically aimed at funding predictive AI models for global military logistics. The DoD was offering $40 million in non-dilutive funding. To secure that federal money, Richard had to sign a mountain of highly classified, legally binding government documents. One of those documents was a sworn federal affidavit, submitted under penalty of perjury, explicitly guaranteeing that Aegis Analytics maintained absolute, unencumbered, exclusive ownership of the intellectual property they were pitching. Richard, driven by pure greed and his trademark arrogance, signed his name on the dotted line, completely ignoring the fact that he was actually just licensing the tech from my personal LLC. The DoD approved the grant, and $40 million of United States taxpayer money was wired into Aegis's corporate accounts. Richard had successfully defrauded the federal government, and the federal government does not have a sense of humor about its money. 2 days after the disastrous boardroom presentation, I was sitting on my balcony enjoying a quiet morning when an unmarked black Ford Explorer pulled up to my apartment complex. 2 men in sharp, dark suits stepped out. They didn't look like tech investors or private investigators. They had the stiff, hyper-vigilant posture of men who carry badges for a living. When I opened my front door, the lead agent held up a leather wallet displaying a gleaming silver shield. Federal Bureau of Investigation, White Collar Crime Division, the agent said, his voice polite but incredibly firm. We are investigating Aegis Analytics and its former vice president, Richard Vance, regarding anomalies in a recent Department of Defense grant application. We understand you were the senior lead data architect. May we come in? Of course, gentlemen, I smiled, stepping aside. I've actually been expecting you. Can I offer you some coffee? I didn't need a lawyer because I wasn't a suspect. I was the star witness. I invited them into my living room, sat them down at my dining table, and handed them a pristine, organized binder that I had prepared the night I was fired. The FBI agents opened the binder. Inside was the original master service agreement, clearly outlining the licensing structure. Beside it was a copy of the termination letter Richard had handed me, explicitly voiding the license. And finally, a digital log proving that the proprietary algorithm had never, not for a single second, resided on Aegis's internal corporate servers. The lead agent spent 10 minutes reading through the documents in absolute silence. When he finally looked up, his expression was a mix of professional astonishment and cold satisfaction. So, to be absolutely clear, the agent said, tapping the binder, when Mr. Vance signed the federal affidavit claiming Aegis owned this intellectual property, he was fully aware that he was merely renting it, and he signed this master service agreement acknowledging that fact 6 months prior to applying for the federal grant. That is correct, Agent. I nodded. He was entirely aware. He just assumed no one would ever be smart enough to check his homework. The agent closed the binder and slipped it into his briefcase. You have been incredibly helpful. I highly advise you to retain your personal data backups, as they are now officially federal evidence. Have a wonderful day. As the FBI agents walked out of my apartment to secure a federal indictment, my phone started buzzing on the kitchen counter. It was an unknown number, but I already knew who it was. Richard had been calling me incessantly for the last 48 hours from various burner phones, desperately trying to undo the nuclear explosion he had caused. I hit record on my phone's call logging app and let it go to voicemail. Listen to me, you vindictive little... Richard's voice crackled through the speaker. He sounded entirely unhinged, his voice hoarse and frantic. You have to turn it back on. Do you hear me? The board is trying to hold me personally liable for the investor losses. Just turn the API back on and I'll give you your job back. I'll double your salary, please. If the investors pull out, the company goes under and I lose everything. He paused, his breathing heavy and ragged into the microphone. Then, the desperation warped back into his default toxic arrogance. You can't do this to me. I made you. I'm going to sue you for corporate sabotage. I'm calling the police. I smiled, saved the audio file, and immediately emailed it directly to the lead FBI agent with the subject line, Supplemental Evidence of Panic. Richard thought he was fighting a civil lawsuit over a failed tech demo. He had absolutely no idea that while he was leaving me pathetic, screaming voicemails, a federal judge was quietly signing a massive stack of search and seizure warrants with his name on them. The guillotine had been hauled up to the very top, and the rope was about to snap. It took exactly 72 hours for the United States Department of Justice to fully digest the evidence, corroborate the paper trail, and authorize the surgical strike. I spent those 3 days catching up on my sleep, enjoying the quiet serenity of my apartment, and ignoring the barrage of increasingly unhinged, threatening voicemails Richard continued to leave on my phone. He had officially transitioned from the bargaining stage of grief directly into a state of sheer, frantic delusion. Suspended by the Aegis Analytics Board of Directors and locked out of his own corporate email, Richard was hiding in his sprawling $8 million mansion in Atherton. Atherton is the kind of hyper-exclusive Silicon Valley zip code where billionaires hide behind massive iron gates and private security patrols. Richard felt safe there. He fundamentally believed that his wealth and his zip code provided him an invisible shield against the consequences of his actions. He was likely spending his days furiously calling defense attorneys and desperately trying to wire his remaining liquid assets to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands before the civil lawsuits from his furious investors could freeze them. White-collar criminals always make the fatal mistake of thinking they have time, but the federal government operates on its own incredibly precise, unforgiving clock. On Tuesday morning at precisely 6 a.m., the tranquility of Richard's billionaire sanctuary was violently shattered. I didn't get this information from Toby. I got it directly from the local news. Because when the FBI raids a high-profile tech executive for defrauding the Department of Defense, they don't do it quietly. They bring a localized army, and the media helicopters follow closely behind. A convoy of 6 unmarked black SUVs, accompanied by a heavy tactical vehicle from the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, DCIS, rolled right past Richard's private community security guards. They didn't ring the doorbell of his massive, custom-built mahogany front door. They breached it with a tactical steel battering ram, the deafening crack echoing through the pristine neighborhood. 24 heavily armed federal agents, wearing dark tactical gear and Kevlar vests emblazoned with FBI and DCIS, flooded into the grand foyer of his mansion. According to the unsealed court documents I read later, the agents found Richard in his palatial home office. He was wearing an imported silk bathrobe, sweating profusely, and frantically trying to smash his encrypted corporate hard drives with a titanium golf club. It was the ultimate pathetic display of a cornered rat. By attempting to destroy the hard drives while actively under federal investigation, Richard instantly tacked on an additional felony charge for destruction of evidence, carrying an automatic 10-year maximum sentence. The lead agent, the exact same polite, sharply dressed man who had sipped coffee in my living room 3 days prior, walked into the office. He didn't yell. He calmly instructed his tactical team to secure the golf club, grabbed Richard by the collar of his silk robe, and slammed him face first onto his custom glass desk. "Richard Vance," the agent announced, the cold steel of the handcuffs ratcheting tightly around Richard's wrists. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, perjury, destruction of evidence, and conspiracy to defraud the United States Department of Defense. We have a warrant for your immediate detention and a secondary warrant for the total seizure of this property and all associated assets." Richard, hyperventilating and completely hysterical, tried to leverage his usual arrogance, even with his face pressed against the glass. "You can't do this. I know senators. I have the best lawyers in California. You have no idea who you're messing with." The agent simply smiled, a cold, predatory flash of teeth. "You stole $40 million from the United States military, Mr. Vance. You don't have lawyers anymore. Because as of 5 minutes ago, under the Federal Asset Forfeiture Act, the government has frozen every single bank account tied to your name to recover the stolen taxpayer funds. You couldn't afford a public defender right now if your life depended on it." That was the exact moment Richard's psyche completely broke. The illusion of his power, his wealth, and his untouchable status evaporated into thin air. He wasn't a Silicon Valley titan anymore. He was just a thief in a bathrobe. The news helicopters, hovering high above the Atherton estate, broadcasted the entire glorious aftermath live on morning television. I sat on my couch, eating a bowl of cereal, and watched the high-definition footage of Richard being frog-marched out of his front door by 2 massive federal agents. He looked completely broken. His head hung low, the flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles illuminating his pale, tear-stained face. But the absolute poetic masterpiece of the morning broadcast wasn't just the arrest, it was the seizure. Because Richard had commingled the fraudulent DoD grant money with his personal executive bonuses to buy his luxury toys, the government laid claim to everything. I watched in pure, unadulterated satisfaction as a heavy-duty flatbed tow truck backed up his pristine, manicured driveway. A federal agent calmly attached a thick steel winch cable to the undercarriage of Richard's obnoxiously bright yellow Porsche 911. They dragged the sports car onto the flatbed and drove it away. They boxed up his computers, his servers, his designer watches, and his expensive art collection. They systematically stripped him of every physical manifestation of his stolen success, leaving his $8 million mansion completely hollowed out. And as the black SUV carrying Richard pulled out of the gates, heading straight toward the federal detention center in San Francisco, I finally finished my cereal. Richard was gone. But the cleanup of Aegis Analytics was just beginning, and the board of directors was about to learn a very expensive lesson about the true value of their engineers. With Richard sitting in a cold, concrete federal holding cell, denied bail because the judge rightly deemed him a massive flight risk, the Aegis Analytics board of directors experienced a level of sheer, unadulterated terror usually reserved for passengers on a crashing airplane. The federal indictment didn't just ruin Richard, it triggered a catastrophic chain reaction that threatened to vaporize the entire company. The Department of Defense immediately froze all remaining grant funds and initiated a clawback protocol to recover the stolen $40 million. The investors who had funded our initial seed rounds began filing massive class action lawsuits for gross fiduciary negligence. The company's valuation officially dropped to absolute zero. For 3 days, the remaining executives scrambled like headless chickens. They desperately brought in highly paid outside forensic data scientists, offering them blank checks to somehow reverse engineer my algorithm and get Project Oracle running again. But without the core data sets, the encrypted logic gates, and the machine learning models securely locked away in my Icelandic servers, those expensive consultants were essentially staring at a blank wall. To make matters worse, Toby, my brilliant junior developer, formally submitted his resignation, citing a toxic and criminally liable work environment, leaving the company with absolutely zero institutional knowledge of how the system was even structured. By Friday afternoon, the board realized they had exactly one option left to avoid total personal bankruptcy. They had to come crawling back to the woman they had just fired. I received a frantic phone call from the company's lead corporate attorney, the exact same man who had sat silently in the glass conference room while Richard stripped me of my life's work. His voice trembled over the phone line. He sounded like a man who hadn't slept in a week. He begged me for a meeting, not at the toxic Aegis headquarters, but at a private neutral suite in the Four Seasons Hotel downtown. I arrived exactly 15 minutes late. I wasn't wearing my usual casual tech bro hoodie. I wore a razor-sharp, tailored black blazer, walked into the luxury suite, and took a seat at the head of the mahogany table. The 5 remaining board members sat opposite me. They were a collection of sweaty, gray-faced old men who looked like they were actively developing stomach ulcers. The CEO, a man who had previously ignored my existence for 3 years, cleared his throat and attempted a pathetic diplomatic smile. "Thank you for coming," he stammered, his hands fidgeting with a gold pen. Obviously, a terrible, unforgivable mistake has been made. We were completely unaware of Richard's rogue actions and his fraudulent federal filings. We want to make this right. We want to make you whole. He slid a thick, freshly printed contract across the table. We are prepared to immediately reinstate you, not as a senior architect, but as our new chief technology officer. We will triple your original salary. We will give you an ironclad employment contract, a massive signing bonus, and we will officially restore your original 5% equity stake. All we ask is that you restore the API connection and bring Project Oracle back online before the DoD officially liquidates our assets. I didn't touch the contract. I didn't even look at it. I let the silence hang in the air for a long, agonizing minute, listening to the frantic ticking of the CEO's Rolex. Then I smiled, a cold, dismissive smile that drained the remaining color from their faces. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but cutting through the room like a scalpel. You seem to fundamentally misunderstand the leverage dynamic in this room. You do not have a company. You have a smoldering crater of federal liabilities. By next week, the DoD will pierce your corporate veil, meaning they will come after your personal houses, your boats, and your private bank accounts to recover their $40 million. You aren't offering me a job. You are begging me for a life raft. I picked up their contract, slowly ripped it cleanly in half, and dropped the pieces onto the table. I don't want a job, I stated, leaning forward. I want the company. I want Richard's entire forfeited equity share, plus enough of your collective shares to equal exactly 51%. I want absolute, uncontested voting control of Aegis Analytics. I want the current CEO to resign effective immediately. And finally, I want a $10 million cash licensing fee wired directly to my offshore LLC by 5 p.m. today before I even consider typing the password to reconnect my servers. The room erupted. The CEO shot out of his chair, his face purple with outrage. That is absolute insanity. That is extortion. We will never give you controlling interest. We will sue you. No, that is capitalism, I corrected him, my voice entirely unbothered. And you have absolutely no legal grounds to sue me for protecting my own intellectual property from a federally indicted criminal. You have exactly 1 hour to draft the new ownership paperwork. If the wire transfer hasn't hit my account by 5 p.m., I am walking across the street to the multinational conglomerate that Richard humiliated on Tuesday. I will sell them the algorithm directly for a fraction of the cost, and Aegis Analytics will be dead by Monday morning. Your choice, gentlemen. Give me the wheel or go down with the ship. I stood up, walked over to the suite's minibar, poured myself a sparkling water, and checked my watch. 59 minutes. They didn't even last 30. The sheer, visceral terror of personal financial ruin and impending federal lawsuits broke their corporate egos into a million pieces. The lawyers scrambled, the documents were hastily redrafted, and at exactly 4:45 p.m., my phone buzzed with an alert from my encrypted banking app. A $10 million wire transfer had successfully cleared. A moment later, I signed the documents that made me the majority shareholder and the sole, absolute dictator of the company that had fired me a week ago. I pulled my personal laptop from my bag, tethered it to the hotel Wi-Fi, and opened the secure terminal. Command, restore API bridges. Command, initialize predictive engine. Execute. With a few keystrokes, Project Oracle roared back to life. But it didn't belong to Richard anymore. And it didn't belong to the board. It belonged to the builder. The federal justice system does not care about your golf handicap, your tailored Italian suits, or the prestige of your former zip code. 8 months after the FBI kicked down his mahogany front door, Richard Vance stood in a federal courtroom in San Francisco to face his sentencing. His expensive defense attorneys had desperately tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the Department of Justice made an example out of him. Defrauding the Department of Defense is not a white-collar accounting error. It is an attack on national security infrastructure. Richard was sentenced to 12 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, completely ineligible for early parole. The man who used to scream at junior developers because his artisanal espresso was too cold is now waking up at 4:30 a.m. every day to scrub aluminum trays in a prison cafeteria for 14 cents an hour. The government successfully seized and auctioned off his Atherton mansion, his Porsche, and every remaining asset to repay the stolen grant money. He was stripped entirely bare, erased from the tech industry forever, remembered only as a cautionary tale of spectacular arrogance. Back at Aegis Analytics, the landscape had fundamentally changed. On my first official day as the majority owner and CEO, I didn't issue a company-wide memo. I just started purging the parasites. I systematically fired the bloated executive suite that had allowed Richard's toxic culture to thrive. I stripped the remaining board members of their operational power, turning them into silent, terrified spectators of their own investments. Then, I picked up the phone and called Toby. He was sitting at home, applying for mid-level coding jobs. I didn't just offer him his old position back, I made the brilliant 23-year-old my new vice president of engineering, effectively doubling his salary and giving him a comprehensive ironclad equity package. We spent the next 3 months aggressively rehiring the smartest, most abused developers in the valley, transforming Aegis from a corporate snake pit into an absolute fortress of engineering talent. But the most critical piece of business was cleaning up Richard's radioactive mess with the federal government. I didn't hide behind lawyers. I flew directly to Washington, D.C., walked into the Pentagon, and sat down with the Department of Defense Oversight Committee. I didn't offer them excuses. I offered them a live demonstration. I showed the generals exactly what Project Oracle could actually do when it wasn't being suppressed by an incompetent, greedy executive. I demonstrated the algorithm predicting supply chain bottlenecks in global shipping lanes in real time, mapping out military logistics with terrifying, flawless precision. The Pentagon didn't just drop the threat of asset liquidation. They were so fundamentally blown away by the actual technology that they tore up Richard's fraudulent grant and signed a brand new, massive, completely legal defense contract directly with my administration. We spent the next year operating in stealth mode, quietly refining the engine, dominating the predictive analytics market, and letting the company's valuation skyrocket far beyond its original limits. Project Oracle wasn't just a prototype anymore. It was the undisputed gold standard of algorithmic forecasting. Exactly 14 months after Richard was hauled away in handcuffs, my receptionist called my office to let me know I had a visitor. I walked out to the glass-walled conference room, the exact same room where Richard had smugly fired me, and found Elena waiting, the razor-sharp chief technology officer of the multinational conglomerate hadn't forgotten about us. She had been watching our explosive growth from the sidelines. She stood up, offered a rare, genuine smile, and slid a leather folder across the mahogany table. It wasn't a $1.2 billion offer anymore. It was a $2.5 billion hostile takeover bid, fully funded in cash and stock options. This time, there was no sweat. There was no panic. I didn't have to fake my knowledge of the product or lie about who owned the intellectual property. I sat down across from Elena, opened the folder, and calmly reviewed the terms. Because I owned 51% of Aegis Analytics, my personal payout from the acquisition was going to be well over $1 billion. I picked up my pen and signed my name. The parasites of the world operate under the fatal delusion that the people who build things are weak. They mistake quiet focus for submission. They think that because we sit in the dark, writing code and building infrastructure, we don't know how to fight back when the lights come on. Richard thought I was just a quiet architect whose work he could steal to build his own kingdom. He didn't realize that the person who builds the castle is the only one who knows exactly where all the structural weaknesses are. He stole my fire, so I burned his entire empire to the ground, swept away the ashes, and built a better one on top of it.